Chapter 1. The First Glimpse. Jessica Taylor had always loved photography. It was more than a hobby, it was her passion. She spent weekends exploring old streets, abandoned buildings, and scenic landscapes, capturing moments that spoke to her soul. She loved how the lens framed the world, how it preserved fleeting instances in time, and how a single image could hold a story, a mystery, or even a secret. That crisp October afternoon was no different. The air was cool, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. Jessica had decided to visit a lesser-known park on the outskirts of town, a place she had read about in an old local blog. It was said to be one of the most serene spots in the city, untouched by the usual crowds, making it a perfect setting for photography. With her camera bag slung over her shoulder, she followed a winding dirt path through towering trees, their leaves in brilliant shades of amber, crimson, and gold. The park was breathtaking. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting intricate patterns on the ground. Birds chirped in the distance, and the occasional rustling of squirrels scampering through the foliage filled the air. Jessica smiled to herself. This was exactly what she had hoped for: peace, solitude, and beauty waiting to be captured through her lens. She set up her camera near a picturesque pond, adjusting the settings to capture the perfect shot. The water reflected the sky, mirroring the soft hues of the setting sun. A wooden bench sat under a towering oak tree nearby, its presence inviting yet eerily isolated. She focused her lens on the bench, clicking a few shots before moving on. After an hour of exploration and photography, the light began to fade, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Deciding she had enough material for the day, Jessica made her way back to her car, the camera still slung around her neck. As she drove home, she felt a sense of accomplishment. There was something about this park, something almost enchanting. She was eager to see how her photos had turned out. Later that evening, she settled into her small apartment, the glow of her laptop illuminating the dimly lit room. She transferred the photos from her camera, watching them load onto the screen one by one. Each image was crisp, the colors vivid, the compositions balanced. She smiled as she scrolled through them, reliving the tranquility of the park. Then she saw it. Her finger froze on the mouse pad. She blinked, leaning closer to the screen. In one of the images, a shot of the empty bench under the old oak tree, stood a shadowy figure in the distance. It was barely distinguishable, a dark blur against the golden foliage. Jessica frowned. She had been alone in the park. She was sure of it. There had been no sounds of approaching footsteps, no sign of anyone nearby. She clicked to zoom in, but the figure remained obscure, its form undefined, almost as if it were an illusion. She sat back, rubbing her temples. Maybe it was a trick of the light, an accidental blur caused by movement, or even a shadow cast by the trees. Shaking her head, she decided not to dwell on it. It wasn't the first time she had seen something odd in her photos. Light reflections, lens flares, and even dust could sometimes create eerie effects. With a sigh, she closed her laptop and got ready for bed, the image still lingering in the back of her mind. That night, Jessica dreamt of the park. In her dream, she stood where she had been earlier that day, her camera raised to her eye. The world around her was unnaturally silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, no breeze. Just an overwhelming stillness. She lowered her camera, her gaze drawn toward the bench. The shadowy figure was there, clear now, standing motionless beneath the oak tree. It had no discernible features, no face, no clothing details, just a dark, human-shaped void. Jessica felt her breath hitch. She wanted to run, to turn away, but something kept her rooted in place. The figure slowly lifted a hand and pointed directly at her. She woke up with a start, her heart pounding against her ribs. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the street lamp outside her window. She exhaled sharply, pressing a hand to her chest. It was just a dream, she whispered, forcing herself to calm down. But as she lay back down, staring at the ceiling, unease crept through her. The image in the photograph, the figure in her dream, they felt connected. And for the first time, she questioned whether she had truly been alone in the park that afternoon. The next day, curiosity got the better of her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Determined to prove to herself that it was nothing, she reopened her laptop and studied the image again. The shadowy figure hadn't changed, still blurred, still indistinct, but now it seemed even more unsettling in the light of day. She decided to return to the park. With her camera in hand, she retraced her steps from the previous day. The park looked just as she had left it, quiet, serene, undisturbed. She walked to the same bench, standing in the exact spot where she had taken the photograph. The oak tree loomed above her, its branches swaying slightly in the breeze. Nothing seemed unusual. Jessica exhaled, half laughing at herself for letting her imagination run wild. She lifted her camera and took another picture of the bench. Checking the image on her screen, she confirmed what she had hoped. There was nothing there. Feeling relieved, she turned to leave. But as she walked away, a cold gust of wind sent shivers down her spine. Instinctively, she glanced over her shoulder and froze. The bench was empty, but the leaves behind it had shifted, forming the vague outline of a figure. A whisper of movement, a trick of the wind, or something else. Jessica's pulse quickened. Maybe it was time to dig a little deeper into the history of this park. She had a feeling this was only the beginning. Chapter 2. Closer and Closer. The following weekend, Jessica went to an abandoned railway station on the outskirts of town. She had always been fascinated by forgotten places, and this one had an eerie charm that intrigued her. The station, long forsaken by time, stood as a decaying relic of the past, its wooden platform rotting, the ticket booth empty and crumbling, and nature slowly reclaiming the steel rails. Tall weeds sprouted between the cracks in the pavement, swaying gently in the cool autumn breeze. Jessica adjusted the strap of her camera bag as she stepped onto the old tracks. The crunch of gravel beneath her boots echoed in the stillness, blending with the distant cawing of crows perched on a leaning lamppost. She took several photos of the rusted tracks, broken windows, and decayed walls covered in graffiti. Vibrant streaks of color clashed against the muted grays and browns of the neglected structure, telling stories of those who had passed through, leaving their marks in secret. She moved carefully, mindful of loose debris, and crouched to capture a particularly striking mural, a pair of hollow eyes staring from a cracked concrete wall. A gust of wind swept through, sending a chill through her jacket. She straightened up and glanced around. It was strange. This place should have felt completely empty, yet something about it seemed occupied. Pushing aside the unease creeping along her spine, Jessica continued her exploration. She found an old bench covered in dead leaves and snapped a picture of the way the rust had eaten through its once sturdy frame. The afternoon light filtering through shattered windows cast odd patterns of brightness and shadow, making the place feel almost alive. She turned and took a shot of the platform, its wooden slats warped and splintered with time. That night, back in her small apartment, Jessica sat at her desk with a cup of tea and uploaded the photos to her laptop. She scrolled through them, appreciating the play of light and decay, the quiet beauty in abandonment. Then she saw it. Her heart skipped a beat. The shadowy figure was there again, but this time it was closer. It stood at the edge of the platform, barely distinguishable, yet undeniably present. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She leaned in, zooming in on the image. The figure was dark, almost blending into the shadows, but its silhouette was sharp enough to see. Tall, thin, unmoving. Jessica sat back, her breath quickening. Had someone been following her? She clicked through each photo from that day, her hands slightly trembling as she examined every frame. The figure appeared in each one, creeping closer with every shot. In some, it was nothing more than a distant blur near the trees. In others, it was standing between the rusted tracks, its posture rigid. And in the last photo, it was just behind the bench she had photographed, looming in the background. A tight knot of dread formed in her stomach. She hadn't seen anyone while she was there. No footsteps, no rustling of movement. She had been alone, hadn't she? Her logical mind tried to reason through it. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe it was a smear on her camera lens. She forced herself to take deep breaths, to calm the wild thoughts racing through her mind. Perhaps she had captured an odd play of shadows. Perhaps her paranoia was simply getting the best of her. Still, she found herself checking the locks on her apartment door before bed. Sleep did not come easily that night. Her dreams were restless, filled with images of the railway station, of empty tracks stretching endlessly into the darkness. In those dreams, she was not alone. A presence lingered behind her, just out of sight, just beyond the edges of her vision. No matter how fast she turned, how quickly she spun around, there was nothing. And yet, the feeling of being watched remained, thick and suffocating. Jessica woke up with a start, her body slick with cold sweat. She sat up in bed, her heart hammering in her chest. It had just been a dream, just a dream. And yet, she could not shake the feeling that it was something more. Determined to ease her nerves, she turned on her bedside lamp and reached for her camera. She would clean the lens thoroughly. She would erase the images if she had to. Perhaps looking at them in the daylight would make them seem less ominous. She plugged in her memory card and pulled up the photos again. The figure was still there, standing in the same haunting poses as before. But then, as she flipped through them for the 100th time, her breath caught in her throat. One of the images had changed. Or at least she thought it had. The figure in this particular photo was no longer standing rigid. It had tilted its head slightly, as if acknowledging her. Her blood ran cold. Jessica slammed her laptop shut and shoved away from her desk. This wasn't possible. Images didn't change on their own. The more she tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, the more she felt something unseen creeping closer. The shadows in the corners of her apartment seemed darker than before, the silence heavier. She needed answers. Tomorrow, she would return to the railway station. And this time, she would not go alone. Chapter 3: The Presence. Determined to solve the mystery, Jessica took her camera to a bustling street market the next day. Surely, in a place filled with people, any strange presence would be explainable. She clicked away, capturing vendors selling fresh produce, children laughing, and street musicians performing. The vibrant energy of the market should have calmed her nerves, yet an unshakable tension clung to her, an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see a shadow lurking nearby, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, just people going about their day. She returned home, exhausted yet eager to examine the photos. Sitting at her desk, she uploaded the images onto her laptop. One by one, she flipped through them, analyzing every detail. The colors, the light, the expressions on people's faces, everything seemed normal. Until it wasn't. Her breath hitched when she spotted it. In one photo, hidden within the sea of people, was the figure again. It stood directly behind a group of shoppers, blending into the crowd. But its face, or lack thereof, was the most disturbing part. Where a face should have been, there was only a void of darkness. No features, no eyes, no mouth, just an empty abyss. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She blinked, hoping it was some trick of the light, a flaw in the camera. But when she zoomed in, the darkness remained. The more she stared, the dizzier she felt, as if something unseen was pulling her in. A sharp knock at her door jolted her out of her trance. Her heart pounded. She hesitated before peeking through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Someone had knocked. She was sure of it, but there was no one there. She locked the door and backed away slowly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The unsettling feeling of being watched refused to leave her. She glanced back at her laptop screen, where the photos still lingered, the figure standing ominously in the crowd. A deep sense of unease settled in her stomach. Could it have followed her home? Determined to regain control, Jessica reached for her phone. She scrolled through her contacts and hesitated before calling her best friend, Mark. He answered after the second ring. Jess? What's up? I don't know, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Something's wrong. Mark's tone shifted immediately. What happened? She swallowed hard, unsure of how to explain it. I took more photos today at the market, and that thing, it was there again. Silence. Then, you sure it's not just a trick of the camera? Jessica exhaled sharply. I don't think so, Mark. It's always there, always watching. And just now, someone knocked on my door, but when I looked, no one was there. Mark's voice was firm. I'm coming over. Relief flooded through her. Thank you. Don't open the door for anyone but me. She hung up and tried to steady her breathing. It was just a photograph. It couldn't hurt her, right? Yet, as she sat there in the dim glow of her laptop screen, the air in the room felt heavier, charged with an unseen presence. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch, to reach. Every small sound, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, felt magnified. Her paranoia grew with each passing second. A soft rustling noise came from near her window. Jessica's breath hitched. She turned slowly, her skin prickling with unease. The curtain swayed, though there was no breeze. Something moved behind them. A sharp rap on the window pane sent her scrambling back with a strangled gasp. Her phone slipped from her grip and clattered onto the floor. Trembling, she stared at the glass, but the reflection of her dimly lit apartment showed nothing outside. Just her own pale face staring back at her. But then something shifted. The reflection changed. A shadow, a shape behind her. A figure with a void where a face should be. Jessica spun around, her heartbeat slamming against her ribs. Nothing. The room was empty. A frantic knocking at the front door made her jump. Mark. She nearly tripped in her haste to reach it, fumbling with the locks before yanking the door open. Mark stood there, his eyes scanning her face, taking in her trembling form. Jess, what the hell is going on? She didn't answer. She just pulled him inside and slammed the door shut. Mark set his hands on her shoulders. You're shaking. There was something in the reflection, she stammered. I saw it. I swear I saw it. Mark frowned, glancing around the apartment. Where? Jessica pointed to the window, but when they approached it together, there was nothing but the night beyond, quiet and still. Show me the photos, Mark said. She hesitated before sitting down at her laptop, pulling up the images. Mark leaned over her shoulder as she scrolled to the one in question. His breath caught. Jesus, Jess. You see it, don't you? She whispered. It's real. Mark stared at the screen, his expression dark. Yeah, I see it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the discovery settled over them like a heavy fog. The figure had followed her. It was getting closer, and it wasn't going away. Chapter 4. The Final Shot. Jessica couldn't ignore it any longer. She needed answers. The shadow had followed her through her days and haunted her nights. It lurked in every reflective surface, flickering at the edge of her vision, never fully forming, yet unmistakably present. She had tried to shake it off, to convince herself it was just a trick of the light, but she knew better. She knew it was watching. With growing dread, she realized there was only one way to end this. She had to return to where it all began. She had to face it. The park was eerily quiet that evening, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The sun was setting, casting long, jagged shadows across the empty pathways. Trees swayed gently, their branches whispering secrets in the breeze. The playground stood abandoned, its swings creaking softly in the wind, and the old lamplights flickered weakly, as though struggling to stay lit. Jessica's fingers tightened around her camera. The weight of it was reassuring, the cool metal grounding her in reality. She had always found solace in photography, a way to make sense of the world. If she could just capture whatever this thing was, maybe she could understand it. Maybe she could end it. She stepped cautiously along the path, her sneakers crunching against fallen leaves. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she raised the camera and pressed the shutter button. The click echoed unnaturally loud in the stillness. She took another photo. Then another. When she lowered the camera to check the screen, her breath hitched. The shadow wasn't distant anymore. It was closer, much closer. She snapped another picture, her fingers trembling. This time, the figure was right behind her. The breath caught in her throat as an icy chill wrapped around her, seeping into her bones. The air grew thick, suffocating. Her heartbeat pounded as a presence loomed over her, cold and inescapable. Jessica turned slowly, every instinct screaming at her to run. A suffocating darkness swallowed the world around her. The distant glow of the lamplights vanished. The park itself seemed to dissolve into an abyss. Her hands clenched the camera, her lifeline to reality, but the lens only captured the void. Then she saw it, a figure, shifting and amorphous, darker than the night itself. Eyes, if they could be called that, gleamed like obsidian pits, absorbing every glimmer of light. A hollow whisper filled her mind, words she couldn't understand but felt, deep within her soul. It was not merely speaking. It was invading, its voice threading through her thoughts like a poison. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to flee, but she couldn't move. She was trapped in place, ensnared by the abyssal presence before her. Her camera. She had to use it. With a surge of desperation, she lifted the device and pressed the shutter. The flash erupted in the darkness, blindingly bright. For the briefest moment, the figure recoiled, its form writhing, distorting. Jessica took another picture, then another. She kept pressing the shutter, her breath coming in frantic gasps as the light cut through the void. And then, silence. The darkness collapsed inward, spiraling into itself. The figure let out a sound, not a scream, but something deeper, a tremor that shook the ground beneath her. The air vibrated with its retreating presence, and just like that, the world snapped back into focus. The lamplights flickered back to life. The wind whispered through the trees. The park was as it had been before, silent, empty. Jessica's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the cold ground. Her fingers shook as she clutched the camera to her chest. She had done it. She had faced it. She had. A shadow fell over her. She barely had time to scream before the darkness surged forward, engulfing her completely. Days later, the camera was found lying on an empty park bench, exactly where Jessica had first spotted the shadow. Its battery was dead, but the memory card remained intact. The last photo was unlike any of the others. It was an image of Jessica herself, but not as she had been moments before. Her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth slightly open as if mid-scream. A dark hand, elongated and unnatural, was reaching for her shoulder. And behind her, where the shadow had once loomed, was nothing but an endless void. Jessica was never seen again.